Many people spend decades practicing a skill only to find their progress has plateaued, causing deep frustration and a loss of pride. Most try to solve this by simply putting in more hours at the library or blindly trial and erroring their way forward, yet they often end up exhausted with little to show for it. In Get Better at Anything, Scott H. Young decodes the science of mastery, revealing that rapid improvement is driven by three essential factors: seeing from others, effective doing, and iterative feedback. Discover 12 powerful maxims that transform learning from a mysterious slog into a reliable engine for excellence. Listen now to start sharpening your axe and finally bridge the gap between where you are and the mastery you deserve. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
We are tackling something today that impacts literally every single one of us.
Yeah, absolutely everyone.
Whether you're trying to learn a new programming language, pick up the guitar, or just, get better at your daily job.
It's a critical subject, and our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack the actual science of mastery using Scott H. Young's 12 maxims.
Right.
We're going to look at why some learning feels completely effortless, while other attempts just turn into a frustrating slog.
Yeah.
And more importantly, how you can intentionally design a reliable system for your own personal excellence.
I love that. So let's jump right into chapter introduction, how learning works. There is this story about the classic video game Tetris that I think sets this whole premise up perfectly.
Oh, the kill screen story? Yes.
Exactly. So back in the 1980s and 90s, players believed that level 29 in Tetris was just mathematically impossible to beat.
Right. They literally called it the kill screen.
Because the blocks simply fell too fast for human thumbs to physically move them to the edges of the screen. But then, fast forward to 2020, and an 18-year-old named Joseph Saley fires up Twitch.
Just casually playing?
Completely casually, chatting with his audience. And he didn't just pass level 29, he made it all the way to level 34.
Which is mind-blowing if you think about the original players, and the underlying question there is why? Why did players like Saley suddenly get so much better 3 decades after the game peaked?
Right, because human beings didn't suddenly evolve superior thumb muscles in 30 years.
Exactly. What changed was the environment. Early players, like Harry Hong, who was one of the first to reach that kill screen, they were incredibly isolated.
Yeah, just playing alone in their living rooms.
Right, trying to figure out strategies completely by themselves. But modern players had platforms like YouTube and Twitch. They started broadcasting their actual hands to the world.
Showing the physical technique.
Yes, demonstrating this technique called hyper-tapping, where a player vibrates their thumb to hit the button more than 10 times a second.
So modern players could literally watch exactly how the masters were holding their controllers. Which brings us perfectly to the 3 foundational pillars of learning we are exploring today: see, do, and feedback.
Right. They could see the technique on video.
They were doing it by playing constantly.
And they got immediate feedback from a global community of experts who were watching them live and critiquing their play in the chat.
When you have all 3 of those factors functioning perfectly, rapid progress is just the inevitable result.
Do you see what works? You practice it yourself, and you adjust based on reality. But if even one of those pillars is missing, your improvement will inevitably stall out.
That makes so much sense. And that takes us right into chapter part 1. See, learning from others. It's really easy to assume that humanity's greatest superpower is our raw individual intelligence.
Sure, our big brains.
Right. But researchers found something genuinely surprising. When they put human toddlers up against chimpanzees and orangutans in raw problem-solving puzzles.
The apes sometimes actually beat the humans.
Yes, which is so humbling.
It is a humbling piece of research. But, and this is key, those same researchers also found the one specific area where human children universally outperform the apes.
Social learning, or imitation.
Exactly. If a researcher demonstrated how to solve the puzzle first, the toddler would immediately copy the action and succeed. The apes almost never managed to do that.
So the old phrase, monkey fit, see monkey do, is actually backward.
Completely backward. The ability to easily learn from the innovations of others is the absolute foundation of human ingenuity. We don't have to invent the wheel from scratch every generation.
Let's look closer at that exact concept in chapter 1. Problem solving is search. Consider Andrew Wiles.
The mathematician.
Right, the guy who famously spent 7 years working in total secrecy to solve Fermat's last theorem, which was this mathematical mystery that had stumped the greatest minds in the world for over 350 years.
Yeah.
How does someone tackle an impossible challenge like that without just, making wild guesses?
To understand his process, we really should look at Herbert Simon and Alan Newell's concept of the problem space. Think of problem solving as navigating a massive invisible maze.
Okay.
Without prior knowledge, you have to rely on what psychologists call weak methods.
Like what?
That might mean just generating a random guess and testing it, or slowly trying to work backward from the exit. If you are dropped in an infinite maze like Fermat's last theorem, weak methods guarantee you will be wandering forever.
Right, because the maze is just too big. So Wiles didn't just use weak methods.
No, he spent years building up a massive library of what are called strong methods from other mathematicians.
Gathering specific heuristics and mathematical invariants.
Yes. In practical terms, he collected highly specific maps, cheat codes, and compasses created by other experts. Those tools told him which parts of the maze were dead ends, which drastically narrowed down that infinite problem space.
You don't become a master problem solver by practicing generic brain teasers. You become a master by acquiring the hard-won knowledge and specific methods of the experts who came before you.
Exactly.
That idea of relying on the masters bridges perfectly into chapter 2. Creativity begins with copying. When we picture someone like Leonardo da Vinci painting the Salvator Mundi, we usually imagine this fountain of spontaneous, untouchable genius.
Just pure inspiration striking.
Right. But classical artistic training wasn't about sitting in a field waiting for original inspiration. It was almost entirely about meticulously copying the works of the masters.
There is a really profound psychological reason for that approach, which is explained by John Sweller's cognitive load theory. The human mind has a severe bottleneck in its working memory.
Like a processing limit.
Think of your working memory like a very small desk. If you try to invent a creative solution entirely from scratch, your desk gets completely cluttered with what Sweller calls extrinsic load.
Which is the mental friction of just trying to figure out the basic steps.
Exactly, like how to mix the paint or how to hold the brush properly. There is literally no room left on the desk for actual creativity.
So by copying what the book calls worked examples, you clear off the desk.
Yes.
You aren't stressing about the basic mechanics, which frees up your mental bandwidth to absorb the deeper underlying patterns of the masterpiece.
Imitation isn't the opposite of creativity, it is the prerequisite for it. Once those basic patterns are secured in your long-term memory, then you can start bending the rules.
So if you're learning a new skill at work, don't try to reinvent the process on day one. Find a successful template, copy it, and understand why it works first.
Absolutely.
That sets us up for chapter 3. Success is the best teacher. Helen Keller famously celebrated 2 birthdays, the day she was born and her soul's birthday, which was the day her teacher Anne Sullivan arrived.
Right.
Before Anne, Helen was trapped. She was deeply frustrated and throwing constant tantrums because she lacked the foundational tools to communicate with the world.
Her transformation highlights Albert Bandura's concept of self-efficacy. We often hear this myth that grit and motivation are forged by failing repeatedly and pushing through the pain.
The whole what doesn't kill you makes you stronger idea.
Exactly. However, research indicates that repeated failure mostly just teaches learned helplessness. Genuine, lasting motivation actually comes from early foundational success.
You need those early wins.
You do. You need them to prove to yourself that your effort actually yields results.
This is such a critical takeaway for anyone who's ever told themselves, I'm just not a math person, or I'm a terrible writer.
Yeah.
It's highly likely you aren't lacking natural talent. You might just be missing the absolute basic building blocks.
Right. If a student never masters phonics and reading or their times tables in math, more complex tasks will constantly overwhelm them. It just crushes their motivation.
But getting those foundational building blocks from an expert can actually be surprisingly tricky, which brings us to chapter 4. Knowledge becomes invisible with experience.
This is a fascinating one.
Consider Rosalind Franklin, the pioneering X-ray crystallographer. When she saw James Watson and Francis Crick's first proposed model of DNA, she knew instantly at a single glance that it was wrong.
Right.
But she initially struggled to explain exactly why to them.
Which seems weird, right? If she was a genius who knew immediately that the model was flawed, why couldn't she just lay out the reasoning for them step by step?
Yeah, exactly.
It's because of a phenomenon philosopher Michael Polanyi called tacit knowledge. As experts practice a skill over decades, their knowledge becomes highly automatic. It literally recedes from their conscious awareness.
Wow.
They look at a problem and the answer just appears intuitively. We sometimes call this the curse of knowledge.
It's like when you ask an IT person for help fixing your computer, and they say, oh, just reconfigure the DNS settings.
Skipping over 5 crucial steps.
Right. Because to them, it's completely obvious.
That is the curse of knowledge in action. World-class experts often make terrible teachers for beginners because they forget what it's like to not know those intervening steps. Their brains simply assume the basics are obvious to everyone.
That makes so much sense. Moving to the next phase of learning, we hit chapter part 2, do. Learning from practice. Because just watching these experts, even the good teachers, is never enough.
No, it's not. Our brains are incredibly evolved, effort-saving machines. They will actively avoid internalizing new knowledge unless they are forced to use it.
You have to put in the reps. But just doing it randomly doesn't work either. In chapter 5, The Difficulty Sweet Spot, we look at the legendary sci-fi author Octavia Butler.
She had a great approach for this.
She used to help struggling writers who were totally paralyzed by the blank page. She didn't tell them to just write whatever came to mind. She made them copy a half-dozen great beginnings from other books, word for word, just to see what was possible.
She was executing the see-do-vile feedback practice loop. She knew that to learn effectively, you have to fine-tune the difficulty. The psychologist Lev Vygotsky called this the zone of proximal development.
Which is essentially the Goldilocks rule for learning.
Exactly. Your practice has to be hard enough to force your brain to adapt, but not so hard that you become overwhelmed and crash.
The book talks about scaffolding here, which is like putting training wheels on a bike. You could use a copy, complete, create method.
Right. So if you're learning to write code, you start by copying a worked example. Then you fill in the blanks of a partially solved problem. Only after mastering those steps do you try to create a new program entirely from scratch.
You have to find that sweet spot of difficulty. Next is chapter 6. The mind is not a muscle. I have to admit, this busted a persistent myth for me.
A very common one.
People used to think the brain was like a muscle, that doing rigorous mental gymnastics, like learning Latin or doing daily Sudoku puzzles, would make you generally smarter at everything else.
Yeah, psychologist Edward Thorndike actually debunked this a century ago.
A whole century ago.
It's a myth that refuses to die. The reality is that skills are surprisingly specific. You do not gain a generic, all-purpose problem-solving muscle by doing brain teasers. What you actually gain are specific production rules.
Essentially mental if-then statements.
Right, for specific domains.
So if you want to get really good at public speaking or writing marketing copy, doing 1,000 crossword puzzles isn't going to help you at all. You have to specifically practice public speaking or copywriting.
The scientific term for this is specific transfer. It means your practice must closely mirror the actual skill you want to perform in the real world. The mind doesn't give you anything for nothing. You get exactly what you train for.
But how do we train to be adaptable? That brings us to chapter 7, variability over repetition. Think about jazz musicians.
Oh, this is a perfect example.
How do they improvise these incredibly complex solos on the spot without ever repeating themselves? They don't just start by getting on stage and jamming.
No, they start with a process called woodshedding.
Right. Woodshedding involves the intense, repetitive practice of highly specific, pre-existing solos. Beginners absolutely need that repetition to automate their physical movements.
But once you reach an intermediate level, repetition actually becomes a trap. Doing the exact same thing 10,000 times will just cause you to plateau.
Yeah.
To break through, you need interleaving.
Interleaving. So instead of practicing the same tennis forehand from the same spot on the court for an hour, interleaving means you mix it up.
Yes.
You practice a forehand, then a backhand, then a volley, simulating a real match.
Because variability forces the brain to stop merely memorizing muscle movements. It forces the brain to abstract the underlying rules of the game.
Which is what makes it useful.
Exactly. That abstraction is what makes a skill flexible enough to deploy in the real world. Whether you're improvising on a saxophone or pivoting during a tense business negotiation.
That flexibility leads directly to creating great work in chapter 8. Quality comes from quantity. When we look at a genius like Thomas Edison, we marvel at his 1,093 patents.
A staggering number.
But what gets left out of the history books are the mountains of absolute duds he produced alongside them.
This illustrates a concept called the equal odds baseline, analyzed by researcher Dean Keith Simonton. The data shows that creativity is, to a shocking extent, a numbers game.
Really?
Yes. Even the greatest geniuses cannot perfectly predict which of their ideas will change the world and which will fail completely.
So the most influential creators are simply the most prolific creators. They take more shots on goal.
Right.
The book suggests using an assembly line method for your own work. Whether you're drafting a report or pitching ideas, You have to ruthlessly separate idea generation from editing.
If you try to write and edit a sentence at the exact same time, you just choke your output. Produce volume first and edit later.
Now we enter the final pillar with chapter part 3, feedback. Learning from experience. Generating volume and practicing endlessly without feedback doesn't make perfect. It just makes permanent.
To calibrate our skills, we have to interact with the real world.
Let's explore exactly why in chapter 9. Experience doesn't reliably ensure expertise. Experience alone can be a massive trap.
It really can.
Take Annette Oberstad, who won a massive online poker tournament with a piece of tape literally covering her own hole cards. She just played the betting patterns of the other players and won.
Incredible.
Contrast that with experienced doctors or professional stock pickers whose performance sometimes actually gets worse the longer they are in their careers.
It seems contradictory, but psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Gary Klein actually agreed on why this happens. They found that intuitive expertise is only a real, reliable phenomenon if the environment you practice in is highly predictable and provides immediate, valid feedback.
Okay, so a firefighter gets immediate feedback on whether a fire is spreading.
Yeah.
A poker player gets immediate feedback when they lose their chips.
Yes.
But a political pundit predicting an election or a doctor prescribing a long-term treatment might not find out for years if they were right.
And without rapid, valid feedback, you aren't building true expertise. You're just building a massive wall of overconfidence. You have to seek out environments that tell you the truth quickly.
That urgency is covered in chapter 10. Practice must meet reality. Learning cannot just live in a vacuum or a textbook. It is a highly communal, situated activity.
Sean Love and Etienne Wenger researched this by observing apprenticeship in a butcher shop.
A butcher shop?
Yeah. They found that the apprentices learned vastly more from the informal lore of the shop.
The culture of it.
Exactly. The unwritten rules, the jokes, the timing, the real-world pressures of dealing with customers. They learned more from that than they ever did from formal instruction.
That completely changes how you view formal education. The book touches on signaling theory, which argues that a lot of what happens in a college degree doesn't actually teach you the specific skills for a job. Instead, the degree just signals to employers that you have the work ethic, the patience, and the social conformity to survive in an office environment. True skill development happens when practice meets reality.
But when you finally hit that reality, progress isn't always smooth.
No, it's not. Which brings us to chapter 11. Improvement is not a straight line. Let's look at Tiger Woods. At the absolute peak of his incredible career, when he was winning everything, he decided to completely tear down and rebuild his golf swing. Why risk a winning formula?
Because of the 3 phases of motor learning outlined by Paul Fitts and Michael Posner.
Okay, what are they?
The cognitive phase, the associative phase, and finally the autonomous phase. In the cognitive phase, you're thinking about every single movement. In the associative phase, you start linking those movements together.
Right.
By the autonomous phase, the skill runs entirely on autopilot. You can play a song on the guitar while having a conversation.
But if you have a slight flaw baked into that autopilot, you'll hit a permanent plateau. Tiger Woods knew that to reach an even higher level of mastery, he had to drag his swing out of the autonomous phase and back into the cognitive phase.
Your progress is non-monotonic. It doesn't go in a straight line up. To correct a deeply ingrained habit, you actively have to unlearn it. And that means you have to be willing to temporarily get much worse before you can get better.
Taking that plunge brings us to chapter 12. Fears fade with exposure. The biggest barrier to unlearning a habit and mastering something new isn't usually intellectual. It isn't a lack of resources or talent. It's purely emotional.
It's fear.
Yeah.
Fear and anxiety are evolutionary mechanisms designed to keep us safely inside our comfort zones. When you try to unlearn a skill like tweaking your public speaking style and you suddenly perform worse, the anxiety can be overwhelming.
Absolutely paralyzing.
The psychological consensus is that the most effective way to beat this is through exposure therapy.
You can't think your way out of the fear. You have to face the thing that scares you. You step outside the comfort zone, get that messy first speech, and let the feedback of simply surviving that scary situation prove to your brain that you're okay.
The fear literally fades only through direct exposure.
Let's tie all of this together in chapter conclusion. Practice made perfect. There's an old fable about a woodcutter who is given 3 hours to chop down a massive tree. What does he do? He spends the first 2.5 hours just sharpening his axe.
Most of us spend our entire lives blindly hacking away at our goals, wondering why we aren't making a dent. We rarely pause to sharpen our axe by actually optimizing how we learn.
We really don't.
But if we deliberately seek out great examples to see, if we construct challenging practice loops to do the work, and if we relentlessly seek out valid, reality-based feedback, we can dramatically accelerate our journey to mastery.
You don't have to stay stuck on that plateau.
Yep.
You have the tools to rebuild the engine.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. If reaching true world-class mastery requires unlearning and being willing to temporarily get much worse, what deeply ingrained expert habit do you currently rely on that might actually be the very thing capping your potential today?
That is a question that will definitely keep you thinking. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, follow up in the next video.